And that's exactly the division that's happening right now when we talk about who supports and stands with Israel and who is criticizing Israel at the moment. It's not amongst the leaders themselves, in particular in Europe, but more amongst the leaders in Europe versus the public opinion. So we've seen all of these protests, as you saw in the package earlier, of people all around Europe staging these mass demonstrations against what's going on in Gaza, in the Palestinian territories, and taking a very critical stand on Israel, using terms like apartheid, very, very specific narratives that they're picking on there. Meanwhile, their leaders have been voicing support for Israel as well as their right to defend themselves. In most cases, you've got countries like the Czech Republic, like Hungary, like Germany, that are very much coming out and saying Israel has the right, clear as day, to defend themselves. And that is a very interesting distinction this time around, where it's not so much the leaders that are at heads over here over which is to support and which is to criticize, but leaders amongst the general public.
Right. Now, as the Israel-Gaza conflict escalated, so too did the involvement of the international community. Our international affairs correspondent, Batya Leventhal, takes a look at the global protest movement that flared up in recent days and some of the disturbing stands and forms that it is taking.
There is no such thing as a fair fight in war. The same could be said for international media coverage and the stance of the global community, as is the case in the latest escalation between Israel and Gaza.
Israel has a right to defend itself when you have thousands of rockets flying into your territory.
There have been seriously disproportionate attacks on Gaza, and they have led to the martyrdom of hundreds of thousands of people.
World leaders, politicians, celebrities joining in and flaming the conflict from afar, sparking a global protest movement. On the one side, Armenia and Turkey, Jordan, France, Germany, Kenya, South Africa, the United States, and the United Kingdom.
We want the whole world to know what Israel is doing to the Palestinian people. It is genocide. It is not conflict or a war. They are being massacred.
With many counter-protests taking place in Italy, Canada, and the US.
They're all hiding in those shelters. It's impossible to live under all these missiles. They are constantly coming at them without any reason. They are civilians, for God's sake.
Many of the demonstrations across Europe turned violent. Some could even be considered openly anti-Semitic.
Many of us are angry, upset, heartbroken by the events in Israel, the West Bank and the Gaza. That's no excuse, though, for anti-Semitism.
The emotion-filled opinions from thousands of miles away are doing little to calm tensions. In fact, they are simply adding fuel to an extremely explosive conflict. Calls for a ceasefire between Israel and Gaza are growing. Perhaps it should also be extended to the online war.
And joining us now in studio is our international affairs correspondent, Batya Leventhal. And Batya, some disturbing views there, especially that protest in the UK. Now, Europe itself, as you mentioned, kind of divided because we see some strong support on the political level for Israel in this conflict, but out on the streets, some of these protests looking quite ugly.
And that's exactly the division that's happening right now when we talk about who supports and stands with Israel and who is criticizing Israel at the moment. It's not amongst the leaders themselves, in particular in Europe, but more amongst the leaders in Europe versus the public opinion. So we've seen all of these protests, as you saw in the package earlier, of people all around Europe staging these mass demonstrations against what's going on in Gaza, in the Palestinian territories, and taking a very critical stand on Israel, using terms like apartheid, very, very specific narratives that they're picking on there. Meanwhile, their leaders have been voicing support for Israel as well as their right to defend themselves. In most cases, you've got countries like the Czech Republic, like Hungary, like Germany, that are very much coming out and saying Israel has the right, clear as day, to defend themselves. And that is a very interesting distinction this time around, where it's not so much the leaders that are at heads over here over which is to support and which is to criticize, but leaders amongst the general public.
Right. Definitely a change of attitude amongst some of those nations in Europe, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. Let's take a look at the region, the response here, for example. Unfortunately, one of the strongest reactions we've seen here came from Israel's closest Arab neighbor, one that it has a peace with. Unfortunately, unlike the Abraham Accords, a cold peace, and that is the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan.
100%. And like you said, a cold peace. And I think that what's interesting now is that the Palestinian Authority there, the parliament, voted earlier today in order to put in a resolution to recall its ambassador from Israel, as well as to get rid of the ambassador that's currently now in Jordan, the Israeli ambassador. And this is a very interesting thing. It's often said that when you start expelling ambassadors, that's when the conflict gets heated up. But I don't think this is likely to spread further than Jordan. I don't even think this could potentially evolve into such a huge threat. And the reason that I say that is because there's so much intense strife going on at the moment behind the scenes between Jordan and Israel. As you mentioned, a very cold type of peace. They're going to want to have to keep that peace on the surface. So this seems like more of a threat in solidarity with the Palestinians and something that's actually going to manifest.
Right. And certainly the Abraham Accords have certainly changed things in terms of the Arab League, in terms of some of those Gulf states like the UAE and Bahrain taking a definitely more subdued tone towards Israel. Now, as certainly criticism of Israeli policy is legitimate, as is expressing support for the Palestinians. But let's face it, seeing some of those things, especially in the UK, people driving in Jewish neighborhoods yelling, rape the Jewish women. I can't even repeat some of the things. This is anti-Semitism. It's not anti-Israel criticism.
For sure. And the way that some of the media is portraying the bias towards or specifically on Israel, according to what they're seeing in the Palestinian, we learned something very interesting in journalism school. If it bleeds, it leads. And that's the story that the international media is leading with. They're touching on the humanitarian aspects of it. And as a result, there's a very difficult distinction when you don't define the Palestinians under a terrorist organization in the Gaza Strip, or just Israel is bombarding the terrorism or the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. There's no distinction between Hamas as a terrorist organization that leads there and what the international media calls Palestinian militants that rule the Gaza Strip. And the same thing can be said at the moment for why there's the spillover effect that people are not making the distinction between possibly being a Zionist or an Israeli and being a Jew. And that is where we get this blatant anti-Semitism of, you saw in the videos of, if the Jews, they weren't calling out Israelis, they weren't calling out Israel, they were calling out Jews. They're burning synagogues, they're throwing things into Jewish schools, harming Jewish areas. I mean, just in London over this past weekend, there was a rabbi that was injured. That's got nothing to do, the rabbi is a UK citizen. It's got absolutely nothing to do with the fact that he's an Israeli, nor what his stance is on this region. So without making those distinctions, for me, I feel like the international media is very much putting up a wall there of saying this is the way you need to view things. There's no distinction between a terrorist organization and the Palestinians in Gaza, and there's no distinction between Jews and Israelis or Zionists.
Right, and let's keep in mind, not just Israel and the United States, but the European Union does officially categorize Hamas as a terrorist organization. Batya Leventhal, thank you for that. Now